So my first statement is wow. Thank you, Alyse. That was amazing, and that's going to set us off on a great discussion. And I can't help asking you to start this conversation off. The qualities that you talked about are the qualities we talk about bridging leadership.
Yeah.
And, you know, we did considerable research, not on gender, but it has always occurred to me that the sort of leading from behind, bringing people together is essentially a feminine characteristic. It's a bridging leadership characteristic, which is not unique to women. And the more men who develop that characteristic, the better off we're all going to be. So I just wonder if you would say a little from your own experience, how did you get there? And how did you form Vital Voices to do this?
Well, thank you, Peggy. So I think it's really interesting because so many of the women leaders that we work with, that you would immediately meet them and think, this woman is, you know, supporting people and helping to rebuild their lives from, you know, after they've been trafficked, or this woman is pulling communities out of poverty. You would immediately think, these are leaders. But yet they did not think of themselves as leaders. They would say to us continuously, I'm just a woman who gets up every day and does the right thing. And a lot of times that's because they were looking at leaders in their countries and communities and seeing a very different model of leadership. They were seeing hierarchical, top-down leadership. They didn't have the title, position, maybe they weren't born into the right family, so they thought, no, I'm not a leader. And it really wasn't until we started to call out these practices that we saw over and over again across generations, across cultures, that women who were leading change, maybe they didn't have that formal title of leader, right? The CEO, the president of their country, but those who were leading change, they had these 5 distinct practices. And that was that they had a driving force or a sense of mission. They experienced something personal, and they decided because of that, they had to step up. They couldn't look away. So their leadership came from a very authentic place. Second, they have very deep roots in their communities, this idea of empathy, which of course, I mean, you know, you think back to, certainly when I was growing up, I mean, you wouldn't say someone was empathetic and thus they're a great leader. But as we know, if you don't have empathy, you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can't lead them forward. And obviously listening coming with that. Third, the crossing lines that divide. We learned that, of course, from women in Northern Ireland first. But this idea of how can we put ego aside and focus on what we can agree on and move from there, because that's the only way you can make sustainable change. Fourth, bold ideas and bold action. The idea that often, you know, when women leaders come along, they will have a different way of wanting to make change. We work with this incredible woman who does graffiti art in the streets of Rio, and through her art, she has actually changed hearts and minds, not just minds, but hearts, in terms of combating domestic violence. And understanding that there actually is a law. But she's used graffiti and the arts, which I know, Darren, you're a big believer in, to make that change. So it's not a typical way, and it's believing in that. And then finally, we saw that all of these women wanted to pay it forward. Not just wanted to, like had to. It like got under their skin. They were invested in, they were supported, they had to give it out. And I think as we began to point out those 5 practices and share them, women would be like, oh my gosh, I am like that. I am a leader. And I think that once they believed that, it was like, this is an opportunity and a responsibility. But you see the light switch, and I mean, to me, that is always that greatest moment when you see that switch go on where someone recognizes, wow, you know, what I have been doing is leading.
Yeah, thank you. And Darren, I know you're starting a major initiative on gender equity at the Ford Foundation. And as a bridging leader yourself, and I'm sure as a feminist yourself, I'd be really curious to hear what brought you to decide to do this, and what are your goals, and to what extent does what you're hoping to achieve mesh with what Alyse is talking about?
Well, I think we're inspired by Alyse, like anyone who would encounter this extraordinary woman would be inspired. And so for the Ford Foundation, we have put the challenge of inequality and justice at the center of our work. If we're to make progress, we have to address the inequality, the injustice that far too many women in the world face. And so programmatically, we have had to understand the depth of that inequality, the different ways in which inequality manifests, and the ways in which traditional approaches to women's rights, women's equalities, has actually left out some women. Mm-hmm. And your and my friend Gloria Steinem have talked many times about how the movement in the United States that Gloria was a big part of left out Black and brown women. That the face of the movement were middle-class white women. Mm-hmm. And that was what the media wanted. Gloria always tells the story of she had one of her best feminist friends often marching with her, alongside her. But the photograph, she was always the Black woman cut out of the photographs. Because what the photographers wanted was sexy Gloria. Yeah. They wanted Gloria. And that's what the media ate up, and that's what the face of it became. And so we have brought a greater focus to the needs and aspirations of Black and brown women, of poor women. And so that's manifest programmatically, for example, in our establishing the first Black Feminist Fund that we're raising $100 million for in Africa, that will be run by, granted by a group of grassroots African feminists.
Wow.
And the Ford Foundation will not be involved in the grant making. We have to internalize the rhetoric of empowerment. A lot of philanthropists talk about empowerment, mm-hmm. but we don't internalize the rhetoric. Because if we internalize the rhetoric, it means we turn over to the communities, to women, to set their own priorities. We don't sit in a conference room in New York as experts. We, as Alyse was saying so well, we center the voices of the people, and we have to listen, another attribute, and we have to approach the challenge with some humility. One of the reasons development failed in parts of the world was because of arrogance, was because of a belief that we here in America knew how best to develop third world countries. And even amongst feminists, we have to listen to feminists in other parts of the world who may not believe that American-style feminism is what they need in their country. Right. And that what we believe a woman's empowerment looks like mm-hmm. is not necessarily right for a community. And so that is a big part of what we're doing, and we are trying to just internalize in our own behavior and our own work.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that, I'm assuming this is global, or is this mainly?
Yeah, no, this is global.
First of all, let's give you
global. But I mean, when you look in the U.S., I mean, there is absolutely. I mean, again, there is the experience of poor Black and brown women on many of these issues is markedly different than it is middle-class white women. Yeah. And so the empowerment of those women, the equity question is, all right, well, if we really believe that, let's look at our portfolio of grant making. Mm-hmm. How much of those dollars are going to Black feminists, brown feminists, women-led organizations? Mm-hmm. And hold ourselves accountable for that.
Yeah. And given that there are definitions of what women's rights or empowerment is in different parts of the world, you mentioned Africa. Do you want to say something about Asia or the MENA region?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I could say a lot about Asia. I mean, where do we start? I mean, we've only got, but no, I think most certainly our work in South Asia is another example, and Alyse knows it well. I mean, the challenge and the complexity of working on a feminist agenda in South Asia is so, I mean, it's so complicated. It's so layered. It's layered with caste. Right? Why is it the women who are more likely to be the victims of sexual violence are Dalit women? Mm-hmm. It's because there's a cultural practice that has normalized the abuse of all Dalits, I mean, just as a matter of life, but Dalit women especially. So if you're gonna work on that issue, you've gotta be lifting up and funding Dalit women-led organizations. And you've got to empower them, and as we were just hearing, they've got to be at the table. And often, they're not in the room, much less at the table in many of the settings.
They don't know the table exists.
They don't know the table exists.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, as you know, Alyse, I mean, this is your work, that this is not normative to invite them in the room.
Yep. Thank you. And I'm going to radically change the subject to one that I think all of us are concerned about, which is during this last period of time with COVID, not only, of course, the health issues were central, but what we're seeing, I think, around the world from people that I've been talking to, is the amount of stress and mental difficulties that have resulted from whether it's being kept inside or having been sick, or the poverty that resulted from things closing down. And I'm just wondering, in your own staffs, have you experienced this stress? Because we certainly have in ours, being separated for that length of time. And just, you know, what your experience is and any advice you have leading organizations that are out there working in the world with people who are being traumatized, but your staffs probably are too.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question that you ask. And I think absolutely, for me, it was probably the biggest test as the leader of an organization to figure out how do you make sure that people are doing okay? You know, how do you make sure that they feel connected to each other, to you? And not only were we separated because of obviously our offices closing down for COVID, but we also, because we were opening up this global headquarters and it was taking longer, we were sort of homeless, as it were. And I think, you know, it's one thing that I feel that I got to do during these past 2 years is I actually got more connected to my team than I ever have before. Because I wasn't traveling the world, I couldn't, right? And also because we were faced with so many challenges, yes, mental health challenges, but also, you know, you think about, I mean, I went through, I think, a radical transformation of digging deeply and thinking, you don't get a free pass on Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. Just because you've dedicated your life to human rights, you do not get a free pass. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the challenges, certainly, with any team that, you know, of people who have dedicated their lives, no matter who they are around the world, you know, to equity, to human rights, to women's rights, you know, to think you don't have to do the work, right? And we really looked very deeply at ourselves, about what we were doing, and we made some pretty radical changes. But honestly, I don't think we would have been able to make those changes had it not been for the pandemic, because it did force certainly me, but I think others, to stop, to think, to look, to be sure everyone was doing okay. I mean, I try to look at things as a gift. So, you know, I think from our perspective, we were able to do that. And now, actually, last week was the first week we've been back together as a team. And it's incredible because we've got, you know, in 2 years, and we know this was, what do they call it? The Great Resignation, or, you know, there's some other term for it. But, you know, I think we do have a lot of new team members. But I think it's astounding at what bringing people together and how people appreciate that, I think, so much more, right? Knowing that we can work apart, but the value of coming together.
Yeah. Thank you. And Darren, you've got staff all over the world.
Yes, I mean, I think the larger issue for organizations like Vital Voices and leaders like Alyse, and I mean, let's be real, I run a foundation. I mean, we're a pretty privileged group of people. We aren't having to raise money. We aren't having to go out onto the front lines to do the work that our grantees are doing. So I start by reminding our staff of that reality and the privilege that we possess and how we think about leveraging that privilege. But I also talk about the context in which we all have to do work as organizations and people committed to the idea of justice. So when your work is justice, and you live in a time when the very idea of justice is so contested, so divisive, it's exhausting. Right? And so part of the challenge for people in mission organizations like Vital Voices and so many of our grantees is that, yes, the George Floyd murder and that summer was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. And you've got to lead and manage and do your work in a context in which the very work that you do is under siege, is under assault. And the people who do the work in organizations like Vital Voices aren't there for the money, obviously. They're not there for stock options. They're not there for long-term income. They're there because it's a calling.
Yeah.
But when your work is a calling, and that very calling is being attacked as something that is bad, it is so taxing on the psyche. And so how do you motivate staff? How do you motivate and inspire staff when, for our generation, social progress and social justice was almost, and this is clearly naive, was almost seemingly inevitable, because we saw a progression of an almost linear progression of progress. As a gay man, I couldn't have imagined that I could marry my partner. I couldn't have imagined that I, as a black gay man, could be president of the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
But that's because of all the progress that we made in the shoulders of the men and women we stand on. And yet, the experience of the discontinuity, I mean, we thought it was linear. Dr. King's idea of the arc, we presumed that the arc was bending towards justice because we could look on the calendar year after year and see progress. And so to all of a sudden, if you were just working on women's issues, to be living in the moment we are living in, and that's your work. This morning I met with Alexis McGill. We had breakfast, the president of Planned Parenthood. And listening to Alexis talk about running Planned Parenthood in the United States of America in 22 was a harrowing narrative to listen to. To motivate women in Mississippi working in the last health center that they run there that will be closed down. How do you motivate those women, the staff, to feel inspired to do their jobs? And so for anyone today who's in this country and in many parts of the world leading organizations with the kinds of missions that many of you work on, many of your partners, it is a compounding sense of trauma. And so we have to put all of that in a context and give people the license to be comfortable with the vulnerability, the trauma, the emotional just challenges that this moment brings.
And that, yes, please. This is so rich. I mean, it could go on for hours.
But we can't.
We can't. But we do have 2.5 more minutes. So I just want to, this will have to be really quick, but there are people out here in the audience from foundations and businesses and NGOs who are really trying to work on a values-led basis. And everything you just said about this crisis opportunity that we've been going through offers the opportunity for, among other things, humility and vulnerability. That is hard. It's one of the reasons why we at Synergos build into the Bridging Leadership curriculum what we call inner work. Because unless we, who are in the situation of privilege, of being able to work in an organization with fabulous people, hopefully make some kind of a difference. But at the same time, as both of you have really expressed, it's demanded another level of opening ourselves. And I just like to hear, if you each want to say one personal thing about what that's meant to go yet that level deeper to get there.
I think the advice that I would give to everyone here who desperately want to make the world a better place and invest is to think of yourselves as venture catalysts, right? We all know what venture capitalists are, right? But often I think when we approach philanthropy, we think of tapping heads, right? How many people did we evacuate? Did we serve? Did we this? Did we that? Rather than thinking about making those deep investments in leaders of change in individual communities who know exactly what to do if just given the support and opportunity. And so very much the same way you would approach, investing in a company, invest in those local leaders.
I would say that I was inspired, of course, by the great work in the philanthropy of John D. Rockefeller, of Andrew Carnegie, and so many. But I was really struck by a speech that Dr. King gave that was actually never published about philanthropy. And he said the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And what Dr. King was saying was that don't be smug and self-satisfied in your wealth. Be humble and be vulnerable enough to examine your own complicity in the very problems that you are seeking to solve. Recognize your own culpability in the systems and structures and culture in your community, in your country, that you are a part of promoting and sustaining. And that's hard work. I think this is the amazing thing about Synergos. Someone who's prepared to have that kind of conversation is what Synergos will give them, that experience of the deep introspection, the excavation of your own issues and your own motivation for giving. And I think this is one of the reasons, Peggy, I have always admired you, because you have understood your privilege and accepted that privilege and the accountability and the important work, as Dr. King reminded us, your responsibility in that privilege, and you have been willing to step up into that moment and be vulnerable and be humble and be a great active listener and be prepared to say, I don't have all the answers.
That's for sure.
Thank you, Peggy Dulany.
Thank you,
we
too.
Love you.